Well, gamers, it finally happened. After years of begging, fan theories, and analyzing each frame of every single DBD post to find hidden clues, the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise has finally found its way into the fog. First things first, I gotta say, I wasn't sure it would ever even happen, even with how vocal the community was about having it in the game. But regardless, I am so happy it's actually here. It seems like based on the reactions of both the majority of the DBD community and the FNAF community, people are pretty happy at the representation Springtrap has gotten by behavior. And I couldn't be more relieved that the community finally seems, for the most part, overwhelmingly pleased with the release. That being said, I have thoughts about everything involved here. Being a channel that mainly focuses on DBD's balance, I feel like I should at least talk about Springtrap, right? As you guys know, I'm not the biggest fan of talking about things everybody else is talking about, but hey, I like FNAF. I've been waiting for this chapter to drop for so long, I feel like it's practically my God-given right, no, my duty to talk about my thoughts on FNAF now that it's really here. And yes, I know I'm a little tardy to the party, like I am for just about everything, so I hope it doesn't come across like I'm trying to mooch views off it. I really do care about this chapter. I know people are gonna say that regardless, but here we go. None of you know this, but I'm a pretty big fan of FNAF. I spent a lot of my childhood playing the games and remember the golden age of going to Scott Cawthon's website and taking a look at whatever teaser he had up that day. I remember watching MatPat talk about the insane rabbit hole, pun intended, that is the FNAF lore and wondering just what every animatronics deal was. I even remember the bait posts where people would throw up images of like fan creations and claim that it was a screenshot from the next Five Nights at Freddy's game. Yeah, I was one of those people. Five Nights at Freddy's, Outlast, and unironically DBD were a big factor in getting me into horror as a genre, and now it has some of my favorite pieces of media ever created. That being said, I haven't exactly been keeping up with the franchise as of late. My obsession with FNAF kind of died off around sister location, but I still keep an eye on it and have a piqued interest every time I hear a new game is coming out. Needless to say, I have a soft spot for the franchise and the fan base at large, so seeing two things I like coming together in such an awesome way is really cool. The idea of being able to jump into a game of DBD as a FNAF character was such a cool concept, and I have no problem seeing why it was the most requested collaboration as behavior claims. I've seen so many posts over the years from people who created concepts for a FNAF chapter, and I can't help but see why. The idea in itself has a lot of potential for some really cool additions to the game. So now that it's actually here, I have some thoughts. The second I loaded into the PTB, I could tell there was something about Springtrap that just clicks. His icon in the menu, the way he slips on the screen rocking the best design he's ever gotten in my opinion. His downright sadistic voice lines, he just works aesthetically. So I guess we'll start there. I've seen a lot of people talking about how they don't like the version of Springtrap as he appears in Dead by Daylight. They prefer him to be sort of a silent killer who doesn't say a word because he doesn't need to. Well, I understand that take. I still don't think there's anything wrong with William Afton's representation in Dead by Daylight. I really like how theatric he is. I think it really works here. We have a ton of silent killers in Dead by Daylight whose whole personality is just stab, 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 kill, kill, kill. And making the killer of the most requested chapter ever completely silent would be a little disappointing in my eyes. I genuinely like how vocal he is. It does a lot to give him a personality that he didn't have for a long time. He feels much more in line with the movie's version of Afton, where he's just a guy who takes pleasure in killing, but also lets himself have a bit of fun doing it. I mean, this is the same guy who sees you down the vent in Pizzeria Simulator and says, "Fascinating." Yeah, I feel like him being a bit of a loudmouth works for his character. Maybe it's just because I'm also dramatic, but I love how theatric everything he does is. Plus, there's always the argument that Scott Cawthon himself had direct involvement in the development of this character. Or chapter, I guess. So if Cawthon thinks it's in character, so do I. That being said, I think every other aspect of his design is universally liked. I mean, he looks absolutely great. I'd argue even better than his debut design. I like the idea of him holding a pizza knife, that's kinda cute, and as for the axe, well, if anything, it's a fun reference to how often he's depicted using an axe by the SFM community, which, unless someone can fact check me, seems to all stem from the depiction of Afton using it during the Living Tombstone song Die in a Fire, which shows him dismantling all the animatronics by beating them with an axe. I don't know, some people really don't like it, but it doesn't bother me really at all, especially in terms of how it affects his general design, which I guess we should get into now. Springtrap's power is centered around the use of his axe and various security doors scattered around the map. The axe is used to throw in short distances to damage survivors, and can even be thrown directly up to hit survivors on the other side of walls as long as you can aim over them. This is a product of the axe's weight and how it tends to arc instead of a, hunter's hatchet which flies kind of in a direction. It has a lot more weight to it, which can be used very creatively. This is where most of Afton's skill expression lies. You can get extremely creative with where to throw the axe and get some absolutely crazy shots if you have the muscle memory to do so. In fact, it's so impressive, it's pretty hard to get mad when you get hit with a perfectly arced shot, sort of like getting hit with a cross-map hatchet by Huntress. It's just a, wow, that was cool response where it's kind of hard to be mad because it took so much skill to do. However, that's not what most people will be doing. For most players, Springtrap's gameplay is going to function very similarly to how Huntress's gameplay works, at least when it comes to looping. It's the simple mind game of, will he take out the axe or not? If you run to a pallet and decide not to drop it, whether you get hit or not will entirely depend on whether Springtrap falls for the bait. For people like me, I don't hate that gameplay, but with how often some people complain about Huntress, I expect there to be a little bit of annoyance from some people, especially with how kind of big the axe hitbox can feel. However, I personally don't mind it too much. Whether you have the axe thrown or not also affects your movement speed. If you have the axe equipped, you move at a slower speed at 4.4 meters a second, like Huntress does. However, if the axe is somewhere else and out of your inventory, your speed is that of a regular killer at 4.6 meters a second, same as like Trapper or any other killer with the normal movement speed. This opens up some interesting gameplay where you can decide the movement speed you want to be, depending on whether or not you want to force a pallet down or not. That's a really fun idea and leads to some more interesting choices you can make, which will always be a good thing. The rest of his gameplay sits with his many security doors, which he can use to traverse the map at a pretty nice speed, sort of like Xenomorph's tunnels. He can use them very often, and also gets a pretty hefty undetectable status effect when he comes out of the doors. I think the coolest part about this aspect of his design is that survivors can also use these doors to traverse the map, as well as use the cameras on top of the doors to keep an eye out for the killer, and mark him if they look at him for long enough, through a wall for some reason. It really just, if Springtrap is in the general frame, you detect him, which is kind of crazy. However, they gotta be careful. If they use these doors at the same time Springtrap does, it's an instant grab. These doors are interesting. They give Springtrap a decent amount of map control, especially if you run a perk like Barbecue or Thrilling Tremors to know where to go after hooking a survivor. However, these doors may present the biggest problems for me. When it comes to the axe, the gameplay is pretty straightforward. I expect for the players who are going to start playing DBD because of Springtrap. On the other end, his doors are the most dangerous thing to balance out of his entire kit. I have the fear that once survivors know how to use these doors as best they can, he's going to fall pretty low in terms of strength. If survivors see the killer coming, they can start running early and use the doors to get across the map with no real indication to Springtrap as to where they went. I already know what you're saying. Well, Skrump, there's an animation where they take a bit of time to get to the other door when they're, you know, in the security room, when they're traversing the security room. You'd be right to say that, but it also heavily depends on how much distance you have on the killer. If you sprint burst to the door and quickly pick a random door far away, it's pretty cut and dry. I'm worried that he's one of the killers that is going to get weaker and weaker as people learn how to play against him. I guess we'll see. I definitely have to do a lot of testing against and as him to see if my fears are rooted in reality, but based on how his power works, it's definitely a possibility. Right now, at this point, it's all conjecture, so I guess we'll see if it becomes a problem later on. But that's his power in a nutshell. You got your axe and you got your doors. That's how he works. Despite the general thoughts about his balance and power, I do see the occasional post saying that Springtrap should have been a stealth killer, as the gameplay of FNAF is all about the animatronics getting closer and closer, and relying on you making a mistake in order to kill you. I mean, I get it, but at the same time, I think the DBD community is pretty vocal about how much they don't really like stealth killers. And you know for a fact, if Springtrap dropped with some sort of stealth-centered power or a macro-based design, people would have thrown a massive fit. I feel like the doors giving you a good amount of undetectable to use is a solid trade-off for him not having a true stealth power. Fact of the matter is, stealth killers have a hard time being accessible to the largest sum of people, and I expect that Behavior wanted this killer to be as accessible as possible. So making him a pretty straightforward close-range killer with a bit of map control was the safest and possibly the smartest thing they could have done. I can't say that I'd have done it any differently. I think aesthetically and gameplay-wise, he feels pretty solid, and while they could have maybe been a bit riskier, Behavior really needed this chapter to be a dub. By making Springtrap simple but effective, he can be easy to pick up and play, as well as having a pretty high skill ceiling in terms of throwing over objects and knowing where to boost your movement speed by throwing the axe. You can certainly complain about them playing it safe. I understand it from pretty much every angle, and I don't have the biggest problem with it. I really enjoy playing as Afton. I think he feels really smooth to play. I love his voice lines. He has a great design. He seems decently strong, if needing a little tuning in some spots, and it feels like he fits right in. So what do you guys think? Do you enjoy playing as and against Springtrap? Do you think he's too strong, too weak? What changes would you make to his power or add-ons? Let me know, I'm very curious. I'll definitely be keeping an eye out just to see what the community really thinks about him, so make sure to leave a comment if you want me to know what you guys think. But that's it for me, gamers. As for right now, as you guys know, I
always come back.